Hi everybody, it is Professor Parish, and welcome back to English 122. It is week 11, so we are nearly 3/4 of the way through the class, which is crazy, right? This week we're going to talk a little bit more about drama, talking about ancient Greek tragedy as well as Shakespeare, but we're also going to review the assignments that are due for this week. So I'm recording this on Sunday, so if you've not completed week 10's assignments, please make sure that you get those in by tonight. Everyone should have their poetry papers back at this point. For the most part, the poetry papers were really good. There were some individuals that maybe left out an element of the paper, but it's something that even if you didn't get the grade that you wanted to on paper 2, I think that the fixes and revisions you can make are going to be very easy to do. And so if you want to raise your grade, I don't think that's going to be an issue with this paper. Some of you may be like, oh, my grade's not what I want it to be, but the revisions should be something very easy to fix. So you will get a chance to revise that paper over the next 2 weeks if you want to. And so hopefully some of you take advantage of that. But if you got an A or a B on the paper, I wouldn't worry about it. I'd say you're fine. So we are going to dive back into our discussion of drama this video, but I also want to talk about the assignments for this week. So scrolling down to week 11, there are 3 assignments. We are going to go over chapter 27 and 28 this week. And then in your Cengage handbook on pages 362 to 380, if you get a chance, scroll through the finding information section. It just is going to help you get some ideas about finding research. In last week's video, I referenced you all to the MLA citation presentation video. Hopefully you got a chance to review that as well. If not, I would definitely go back and do that. But for this week, you have your discussion forum, the outline for paper 3, and our final reading response. This is our last reading response of the class. We only do 4, so you can do your happy dance now. The outline for paper 3 is pretty much exactly like the other outlines we've done for the other papers. I just want a bare bones skeletal structure showing me how you're planning to organize your points for paper 3. So far, all the topics I've seen look great. You should get feedback from me by tomorrow or Tuesday on your paper topics, making sure that they all will work out. But so far, everybody's topics seems like they're going to be great. So the outline is just you explaining to me what you're going to do as far as organizing your thoughts and what points you're going to touch upon in your paper. And of course, it's not set in stone, so you can change this around as you write your paper. But our last reading response. So I've pulled up the guidelines here for that. As far as the reading response goes, this one's pretty straightforward. In our textbook, there is Antigone and Hamlet, which are 2 very, very, very famous plays. Antigone is obviously on the Greek tragedy spectrum. Hamlet is on the Shakespeare spectrum, although it is a tragedy as well. So some of you may be choosing Hamlet for your paper number 3, and some of you may be choosing Antigone. So this will be a very good refresher for you for those papers. But even if you're choosing a different play, that's okay. So what I have here is that there are 2 videos that are summarizing the plots of Antigone and Hamlet, because as much as I would like us to spend time reading both Antigone and Hamlet, because I believe they're very good plays and they're worth reading, we just don't have the time. And honestly, if you take Intro to Theater out here at SIC, or if you take Intro to Drama, you'll probably get a chance to read these plays in their entirety. So we just don't have the time to delve into them in this class. But these 2 videos summarize the plot very concisely and very distinctly. The Antigone video is actually created by a student. And so I really like that it gets to be a student's voice talking about the paper and breaking things down in a very conversational way. I will say this about the Hamlet video, though, and I apologize ahead of time. This video is very thorough. It gives you every bit of plot detail that you need to know about Hamlet. The narrator of this video is very dry and boring. And I apologize, but it's honestly, of all the videos I found explaining Hamlet, this one was the most thorough. And I liked that about the video, but I will apologize. The guy reading it, man, he needed a cup of coffee or something, because he's really, really dragging in this video. So I'll apologize that for ahead of time. But what I want you to do is watch both of these videos. They're about 8 to 10 minutes long each. And then once you're done with that, There are 4 questions down below here that you'll answer for your reading response. Question 1, what is the defining term from our textbook on Greek tragedy and Shakespeare that can be applied to both of these plays? So give me a term from our Greek tragedy section that applies to Antigone, and give me a term from our Shakespeare section that applies to Hamlet, and explain why for each. That's question 1. Question 2, these 2 plays, while written in different time periods, have a lot in common. Compare and contrast the 2 plays. Specifically, how are their plots similar and different? And what about the relationships between Haman and Antigone and Hamlet and Ophelia? So I want to know, what are the similarities and differences between the plots and the relationships of our main characters between these 2 plays? Because there are similarities, but there's also some pretty significant differences with each. 3, if Antigone were a Shakespearean play, what would be different, if anything? And explain. And if Hamlet were a Greek tragedy, what would be changed, if anything? And I include that if anything, but honestly, there are things that could be different or changed with each of these plays had they switched genres. There's lots of similarities, but there could also be some differences. So please, answer it with some difference for each question. I've had some students be like, nothing would change, and I'm not going to give you points for that answer. So just be sure that you write some kind of difference that would happen with each. All right, and then overall, the reading responses are usually just a page in length, but you can make them longer if you need to. But also make sure that you have a brief introduction and a brief conclusion. And by brief, I mean it can be a couple sentences. Like, hey, this reading response is going to talk about this, and now that you've read this reading response, here's my conclusion. So just something basic to kind of frame the response. All right, but that's our final reading response for the class. Enjoy. I actually really like this reading response because I feel every semester that I've assigned it, people bring out differences and similarities that I hadn't thought about, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. So I'm really excited to see what you all come up with for that. So you have your outline, you have your reading response, and then we have our discussion forum for week 11. And in week 11, this is what I kind of hinted at last week. There are these 3 short videos, and they're very short. They're only like a couple minutes each. But they are talking about how plays and film are different. If you don't know the actor John Malkovich, he's been in so many things. And once you see his face, you'll be like, oh, I know who that guy is. He is actually a theater-trained actor. So he started out as a play actor and then transitioned over to film. So in one of the videos, he's talking about how plays and films work differently. And I really like the analogy that he comes up with for describing the feeling of being in a play versus acting in a film. I think if any of you in the class have ever been in a play before, you will instantly understand what he's talking about. I've been in plays, and so when I watched that video, I was like, oh yeah, I can totally relate. And then the other questions are explaining how plays and television are similar and using terms from our chapters 26, 27, and 28, which we'll talk about chapters 27 and 28 in this video. And then between Greek tragedy and Shakespeare, which subgenre of drama do you prefer and why? Which one would you prefer over the other? I'm just curious. But anyway, all of your initial posts are due, and I'll have to change this due date. They're due by Friday, October 30th, with peer responses due Sunday, November 1st. So I will actually change that in the discussion forum. I forgot to change that from last time. So those are our 3 assignments. And so one thing I want to note before we talk about chapters 27 and 28, if you go to our resources and handouts page and you scroll down to week 11, there is actually an example paper for paper number 3. So I chose the student's paper. I will admit it's not the best paper that was submitted that semester, but I liked the consistency and terminology that the student used, and their works cited page and in-text citations were very good as well. So if you download that, you can kind of see this example paper. It's from a few years ago, but they talk about Death of a Salesman, and I really like how they break it down. They talk about everything that they need to. They're very concise and specific, and then they also include their in-text citations, and they have a works cited page at the end that's very nicely constructed. So if you need to look at an example paper for number 3 to kind of see the structure that I'm looking for, this one's pretty good. It's not the most descriptive, and it's not the most polished paper that I've ever read, but it's very, very concise and meat and potatoes. It's got everything it's supposed to, and it does what it needs to do. So it was an A paper. All right. So with that being said, if you have questions about the assignments for this week, please feel free to let me know. But we are going to spend the rest of this video talking about chapters 27 and 28. There we go. So chapter 27 is about Greek tragedy, which it's kind of crazy to think that we're talking about plays that have existed for thousands of years. That's kind of crazy to me that we're still talking about them. And the terminology that this genre brought up with drama is terminology we're still applying to stories that we tell and act out, which is crazy, right? That we're still doing that thousands of years later. It's mind-blowing to me. But the main terminology that chapter 27 brings out is we talk about the messenger. If you've ever heard the phrase, don't shoot the messenger, that's where this comes from. Because in a play, especially Greek tragedy, the messenger was the person that would deliver news to various characters. Typically the news was bad, like a character had died, or there was a war about to start, or something bad was about to happen. So usually when they say don't shoot the messenger's like, I'm just relaying the news, I'm not the one that created it. So that's where that idiom and that terminology comes from. The term genre actually came about because of Greek tragedy. It's just genre just means types of writing, and we see the word genre everywhere now, like genres of music and genres of film. It's a very commonly used term. Complication is the problem of the starting conflict. It's what really starts the conflict in general. What's the complication? What is making things happen in the story? This word is actually French. It's denouement. It's the unraveling of the plot that leads up to the climax. So it sounds very French, denouement. And what this is that once the plot gets going, things starts happening and starts unraveling. And just like we talked about with prose, it's a building action that leads to the climax. The peripety is the twist in the story that leads to the climax. So what's the big twist at the end? Since it's Halloween, I always think of Saw. In Saw 2, I'm not a horror movie fan, but my friends make me watch them sometimes. And in Saw 2, there's a twist at the end of the story that you don't see coming. And you're like, oh, when did this happen? That's a peripety. And then catharsis is a purging or cleansing of feelings. And most Greek tragedies and Shakespearean tragedies have a big mood of catharsis. Usually lots of people die, bad things happen, and there's this just like purging of emotions by the end of the play where the characters are just empty husks. And it's really sad and bittersweet and heartbreaking, but that's catharsis. With any Greek tragedy, usually the main character had what we call a tragic flaw, and that's that they'd have a fatal weakness. Like they'd have one thing that was a weak point of their character. And for the most part, it was hubris, which is another word for pride. Like characters would be too proud to heed the advice of others. They'd be too proud to back down and listen to reason. They would do things because they thought it would hurt or help their own self-image, and that ended up hurting them at the end. So pride was a big downfall for a lot of Greek tragedy characters. Pathos, you've probably heard of pathos in English 121. Usually what we think of as pathos is the emotional persuasion of something. In Greek tragedy, it just meant suffering. It was just a total negative emotion. And then you have your antagonist versus protagonist. That was a big theme with Greek tragedy. There was one character versus another. And I know in prose, we talked about how the protagonist is not necessarily a good person, but in Greek tragedies, they kind of were. They were usually the good guy, and then the bad guy was the antagonist. So we've evolved that terminology with antagonist and protagonist over the centuries. But back in Greek tragedy days, usually your protagonist was your hero, and your antagonist was your villain. And this leads us to Shakespeare. And I love how our chapter talks about Shakespeare being incredibly influenced by Greek tragedy because it's so apparent. If you read Hamlet or any other of his famous plays like Macbeth or Oh my goodness, my mind's going to go blank. But The Tempest, if you read any of those, there's such a Greek feel to them. Like, you kind of think that they were written back centuries before Shakespeare's time and he's just retelling them. But no, he drew a lot of influence from Greek tragedy because he knew how influential and how, celebrated and liked those types of plays were. And he wanted to kind of recreate that for his own era. And we've done the same thing with Shakespeare's plays. Ironically, we've taken his plays and recreated them for modern audiences. So it's kind of cool that we see this trend of us taking plays and revisiting them and revitalizing them for a modern audience. It's kind of cool. But Shakespeare kind of transformed the way that we see plays. So he was kind of revolutionary in that regard, especially for Western plays. So back in the Greek era of plays, there weren't props. There weren't big elaborate set designs. You were mainly just on a concrete stage and you were in robes, and the only prop or really makeup or decoration you had would be these giant paper mache masks. Because if you think about it, you had people watching your play from hundreds of feet away. So in order to know which character was which, you had these giant paper masks so that people could identify the characters. And there weren't microphones, so you just had to shout and hope that your voice amplified and could reach the audience. But Shakespeare kind of revitalized everything. He not only created the Globe Theater, which changed the way acoustics work for a theater stage and the way people viewed plays, but he also created certain things like stage business. And stage business was a term that meant a fast moving of props and set changes throughout the play. So Shakespeare's like, no, we should create an environment that the play happens in. There should be sets and props and items that characters interact with to make it seem more engaging. And that just wasn't something that in Western plays had been done before. It was pretty revolutionary at the time. He also created his own subgenres of plays. So intrigue and revenge tragedy, Hamlet being probably his most famous revenge tragedy. Intrigue just means mystery or suspense or thriller. He kind of became the coin of phrase creator of those types of genres with plays, and other playwrights started to imitate him. And then obviously, yes, Hamlet is the most famous of his revenge tragedy subgenre. Shakespeare drew a lot of influence from Greek mythology, so tales and legends of characters like Hercules and the Roman and Greek gods and goddesses. And obviously he didn't write specifically about Greek goddesses and gods, but a lot of his characters are kind of based upon those types of tropes and archetypes. And we've talked about the term archetypes in our previous chapters, and Shakespeare drew a lot of influence from that. He also wrote some of his plays with a very poetic style, so he used a lot of blank verse in some of his plays, which is an unrhymed iambic pentameter style of playwriting. So, Shakespeare was a triple threat. He was a writer, a poet, and a playwright. So, he could kind of mix these genres together in his own work, and it was incredible. I really like this term that he kind of coined, and that is that of the colossal protagonist. And when I think of colossal, I actually think of Greek times. So it's kind of cool that it's a Shakespeare term. And a colossal protagonist is a main character that overshadows all of the other characters in a story. So, I don't know how many of you have read Hamlet, but if you have not read Hamlet, I want you to tell me, what's the name of another character besides Hamlet? Now, if you've read the play, you're probably thinking of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Ophelia, Claudius. That's the ones that's coming to my mind. But if you've never read Hamlet before, you probably are having a difficult time naming other characters other than Hamlet. And that's because Hamlet's a colossal protagonist. Shakespeare was writing at the time to try to get people to come to his theater to see these plays. So his goal was, I need to create word of mouth. I need to create buzz. There were no email blasts. There were no Facebook posts. There were no text messaging. There was no advertising other than a poster on the side of a town square and word of mouth. That's how people came to know to come to these plays. So Shakespeare's like, I need to have my main character be so powerful that it gets people to talk about them and spread the word so that other people come see this play. So characters like Hamlet and Macbeth are colossal protagonists because it's hard to name the other characters in the series or in the play and be able to have that same emotional response to them. Like if I ask you, name me some characters from Harry Potter, you can probably say, oh, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Draco, Voldemort. You can name off a list of characters because they're all rounded, complex characters. But if I say, okay, name me 3 characters from Macbeth, not just the witches, or Macbeth, it's hard, right? So that's just the idea of the colossal protagonist. And there are modern examples of this where you can see modern shows and plays that have colossal protagonists and the other characters are just kind of side characters and everything. And I will probably ask you in the exam to name me a colossal protagonist. So just be ready for that. And then on page 1371, we have this section called Juxtapositions, and it deals with the play Hamlet. And I really like this section, so I encourage you to go look at it. But on page 1371 in the Juxtapositions, what it is a series of personal essays that people have wrote about Hamlet, examining it through different lenses. So there's one on Hamlet through a psychological perspective, and that one's really cool because this is back in the 1400s. So this author is saying, okay, let's look at Hamlet through the juxtaposition of a social work angle. Like, did Hamlet have some kind of like inner traumatic or psychological disorder? And they examine that. Also looking at Hamlet, there's one that goes through like a feminist lens. So let's look at the character Ophelia and how she was treated and how her character was treated and what does that say about women in that time period. There's another one about Hamlet through gender and masculinity. There's several different gender juxtapositions about Hamlet starting on page 1371. And I really encourage you, the psychological one's probably my favorite because it's most interesting to me, but I would encourage you to go check that out, especially if you are choosing Hamlet as your play for paper 3. I think that you'll find some really cool information there that you can cite in your paper. And that is it for this week. Next week we'll come back and talk about American drama. But in the meantime, I hope that you all found that engaging and informative. I'm excited to see your final reading responses. I'm excited to see your discussion forums and your outlines for paper 3. I think paper 3 is a fun paper because of just how basic it is. It's pretty much straightforward in what is being asked of it. And I haven't looked at everybody's paper topics, so I'm excited to see the rest of them today and tomorrow to get you guys feedback on that. But I hope you all have a wonderful week. In the meantime, please stay safe, take care, and I'll be back next week to talk about week 12. Have a great week, everybody, and I'll talk to you all soon.